Thank you so much, Bob. I'm delighted to be here and doing my program for you. And you have a beautiful library, and this is a lovely room. What I'll be doing is I'll be telling you a little bit about my life as a professional touring musician, and then how I started to experience hearing loss, and how I came to stop playing entirely. For 3 years, I didn't touch my instruments. I started on violin, but then switched to viola when I was in high school and play both instruments. The viola is my professional instrument. And then after 3 years of not playing, through various twists and turns, I came back into playing again. And I also advocate and educate for people with hearing loss and about hearing loss. And I love doing it. It gives me a great deal of pleasure. So just to tell you a little bit about my background in my professional life. Oh, and I'm going to interrupt myself here. I already said this to a few people who were here earlier, but it's really important to me that you're able to hear me, having hearing loss myself, and I know what it's like when you can't hear. So if at any point I forget to hold the microphone close, if you have hearing loss, could you please raise your hand, and that will remind me to keep it here. Sometimes it kind of drifts away, and you notice it's harder to hear when it's out here. So I will do my best to hold it here. I also have a pickup mic here. That's a new experience for me for the videotaping for the, Chris, could you say what it's Harbor?
Harbor Media, yep, the community access for Hingham.
Community access, great. So, well, I was very fortunate to have a 50-year rich and rewarding career as a performing violist, and got to tour the world, play in major capitals. When I was 16, I played at the White House for the Kennedys with several other people, and that definitely dates me. And I played in a string quartet with Yo-Yo Ma, who is, I think probably a lot of you have heard of Yo-Yo Ma. He's a charming and delightful person, just the nicest person in the world. And that was a great pleasure getting to play with him. I played with a chamber music group in residence in southwestern New Hampshire, the Apple Hill Center for Chamber Music. I was part of the chamber players there. I was a founding member, and was very fortunate to be with that group for 24 years. We had a program in the Middle East called Playing for Peace. It started in Israel, and through private funding, we went to Israel. We had workshops and met with young students who played music, and they were both Jewish and Palestinian Israeli students who never would have had the opportunity to play together. So they came to the workshops that we led, and we coached them. And then a few of them were selected to receive scholarships to come and study at the summer program that we had, and which is still going on, I'm happy to say, at the Apple Hill Center for Chamber Music in Nelson, New Hampshire. If you're ever up in that area near Keene, and you go about 10 miles out of Keene on Route 9, Apple Hill Road is right off of that Route 9, and you can take a little detour. I think it's the most beautiful road in the world. It's the road that goes to Nelson. Take that road and you'll come across this idyllic farm with a barn and an old farmhouse, and if it's the summer, you'll hear music coming out of every room. So I was very fortunate to be part of that group, and chamber music was my big love. I definitely enjoyed orchestral playing. I also loved playing in a pit for opera, dance, and musicals. I got to play with Mary Martin and Robert Preston when they premiered I Do, I Do in Boston. That was a lot of fun. And Robert Preston, do you all remember Robert Preston? He was the music man. I came across him backstage, and he pinched my cheek. So of course I didn't wash it for a week afterwards because I really like him. He's a charming fellow, very nice. And Mary Martin was also, she was definitely the diva, but she was a good egg. So I felt really lucky to have all these wonderful experiences. I also played for many years at Emmanuel Church in Boston, where during the school year they have a Bach cantata as part of the liturgy every Sunday morning. And that's another wonderful place to stop off. If you happen to be in downtown Boston, at the Arlington Street end of Newbury Street, the Emmanuel Church is right there. There's a beautiful stained glass window inside by someone who's not as famous as Tiffany, but every bit as much of an artist. The artist is Crown and Shield. And there's also a beautiful little chapel in the back for smaller services. And the music program there is wonderful. So on Sundays, if you happen to be or anytime if you happen to be in the area, it's a lovely place to stop by. And the cantatas start around, I think around 11:30. So if you're there around 11:30 and stop in, you can hear some wonderful music. So as I say, I was very, very fortunate. I also got to play a solo concerto with the Boston Pops back in the days when Arthur Fiedler was conducting. That was very exciting, a lot of fun. And just back up a moment, while I was in residence in New Hampshire playing chamber music with the Apple Hill people, I was also coming down to Boston and doing some concerts there. I started out freelancing in Boston. And so I did both. I drove back and forth a lot between Boston and New Hampshire. Also, I wanted to mention that I started on violin in class lessons in Winchester back in the day when public schools had great music programs. I don't think I would have become a musician if it hadn't been for that public school program. So I'm very grateful for that. And it makes me sad to see that so many music programs in the schools in the public schools are no longer happening. Because research now is proving what I think a lot of us already knew, that music is wonderful for the development of the brain. And children who study instruments and who study music have great advantages in terms of other disciplines like math and just in general, in terms of learning in general. So then when I was in my 50s, I started noticing I was having a little trouble hearing. Now, I don't want to embarrass anyone, but I would just be curious to get a show of hands of how many people either have hearing loss or have someone close to them, a friend or a family member who has hearing loss, to see how many of us are affected by it. So that's a good number. That's a good number. And I think that hearing loss hasn't gotten a lot of attention. I think that's changing. I think blindness, which it's often compared to, has gotten more attention. I think there's a lot of ignorance about hearing loss, and I think there's a stigma attached to it, which blindness doesn't have. And I think part of the problem with hearing loss is that it's a hidden disability. You can't tell by looking at someone unless you look closely at their ears and see if they have a hearing aid there. And a lot of people can't tell. I mean, I've talked to people for years and then said, oh, I didn't know you had hearing aids. And I pulled my hearing aid out and show it to them, and they're surprised. So in my 50s, I started noticing that I was having trouble understanding what people were saying. Music wasn't a problem. Music was fine, but it gradually got worse and worse. Being a musician, I really didn't want to face this. I think it's very easy to have denial around hearing loss and not want to face the fact that there's something wrong and something that's getting in the way of communication. I think that's a big hurdle for lots of people to overcome, and maybe one of the reasons why there are so many people who have hearing loss who aren't treated for hearing loss. And I'll get back to that some more later. So and also being a musician, the idea of wearing hearing aids, I didn't want people to know that I had trouble hearing because I was afraid it would affect my career, affect my being hired to play music. But as time progressed, it got worse and worse, and I realized I really needed to get them. I had a good friend who kind of talked me through it, who got me over the hump of going ahead, going to the audiologist, getting tested, and finding out that I had a moderate to severe sensorineural hearing loss, which is the most common form of hearing loss, which is unfortunately at this point is not treatable, although there's a lot of research going into actually curing hearing loss, but that's down the pipeline. But it can be mitigated with hearing aids and other devices. So I got my hearing aids, and I wore my hearing aids in rehearsals so that I could hear the conductor or my stand partner, whoever I was playing with when we were talking about the music, so I could hear them talking. But I took them out for concerts because the music just didn't sound that great with the hearing aids. Then after some time went by, I realized I really needed to use my hearing aids in concerts as well, but the music just wasn't as good. And I think it actually affected my playing without my realizing. I think my sense of pitch wasn't as good with the hearing aids. I think they distorted the pitch a bit. So the final blow, I guess you could say, is when I had the realization that it was time for me to quit. I was playing a cantata at Emmanuel Church in Boston, and it was a section that's called a recitative, which is almost like a spoken voice with a very simple accompaniment. And quite often the conductor will stop conducting at that point and let the players just follow the singer. But I could not hear the singer. So I could only guess and only follow the bows of the other people. When they moved their bows, I moved my bow, but it was torture because I was not used to being in that situation. And at that point, I thought, this is awful. It's no fun. It's just too hard. I don't want to do this anymore. I also did not want to put anyone in the very awkward position of having to tell me that it was time to stop playing. That's very tough, both on the person who relates that information and the person who receives it. And I've known of situations of musicians where that did indeed happen. So I decided no more. I was going to end my professional career. So this was 7 years ago. And I was very fortunate, and then the last 3 concerts I played were all Bach, and I love Bach. So I played a Bach cantata at Emmanuel Church, the last one I played there. I played the Bach B minor Mass with the cantata singers. I don't know if any of you have ever been to their performances. Wonderful choral group conducted by David Hoos, an old friend, and that has some of the music in there is absolutely to die for. And then I played a concert of Bach cantatas at Marlborough. The conductor who conducted there for many, many years, who was part of the Marlborough music group, Blanche Moïse, had died. She was still conducting things like the St. Matthew Passion when she was 93. She was amazing. And so this was a memorial concert playing her favorite 3 Bach cantatas. And that was my last concert. I had a student whose father was standing in the audience, at that concert, and they had a reception on the stage, and he came up after the concert and came over to the viola section. He came over to me and he said, "I understand this is your last concert." And I said, "Yes, it is." And he said, "Let's just take a moment and think about that." And that's when I lost it, because that's when it really hit me. However, I had decided to treat my hearing loss as a neutral event, neither good nor bad, just something that happened in life, and just to adjust to it and not not get too upset about it. It was a neutral event. That was my goal, to treat it that way. I didn't touch my instrument for 3 years. I completely turned my back on playing music. And people would ask me, they said, don't you want to play for your own enjoyment? And I'd say, no, it's not enjoyable. I can't play the way I used to play. I don't enjoy it. So why would I want to do it? So for 3 years, didn't come near the instrument. And then an incident happened. Some very dear family members, actually my former sister-in-law and her husband, dear and generous people, bought me some very nice hearing aids. And one of the obstacles to get hearing aids is that they're so incredibly expensive, and not everyone can afford them. And insurance doesn't pay for them. I think that may be starting to change a little bit, but back then, had to shell out between $3,000 and $5,000. And these dear family members paid for my most recent set of hearing aids, which are 4 years old now, so they're probably going to be due to be replaced soon. I think they were hoping that I could continue my career in music with these fancy hearing aids, but that didn't work out. But anyway, so Gene had a very bad fall and broke his neck and almost died. And this was really upsetting. And he loved music, and he did survive. And during his recuperation, I went down to help out, and I wanted to do something special for him. He played piano by ear, and they had a piano in their house. I thought, what can I do for Gene and Dolly? They've been so generous for me. And I thought, well, I'm going to get out my viola and see maybe if I can do a little playing for them. And I had a good friend in DC area. He was a pianist that I did a lot of chamber music concerts with. And I asked him if he would play, and he said he'd be delighted. So I took out my viola. I played for 15 minutes, and it felt terrible. My hand felt like a salami. It just didn't feel like it could do anything. But I persisted, and after about 20 minutes, I thought, it's still there. That muscle memory, it's still there. I can do this. In this situation, I can do it. And so we did this little program. Dolly and Gene loved it. And I thought, maybe there's something still here. Maybe there's some way that I can still be useful to people as a musician. The next thing that happened was, I want to interrupt right at this moment and play you one of the pieces that I played for Gene. It won't be with keyboard, but it's still a beautiful melody. It's from one of the Bach cantatas, and originally for oboe. I just want to say I'm going to be playing a lot of short little pieces, so please don't feel you have to applaud after every single one. Okay, here goes. The next thing that happened, oops, I just don't want to trip here. The next thing that happened was a friend of mine mentioned that that her sister worked at a daycare center for special needs adults in the Back Bay of Boston. And that sometimes they had someone come in and play music. And I said, well, I can do that. She said, would you? And I said, yes, I'd love to. So I went there, and it was so nice. The people there were so appreciative, and it felt very meaningful. And I took both my violin and viola. I did some solo Bach, but I also played some show tunes and traditional songs and some things that they could sing along with. And I just want to mention here in passing that when I played with Apple Hill and when I played professionally, one of my favorite things to do was to play for special audiences. When we were rehearsing one time at Apple Hill in the barn where the concerts take place, there was a flutist who was part of the group who had a flute student who was in special needs, special ed at Keene State College. And she had a class of children she wanted to bring up to Apple Hill and have them hear rehearsal. We were playing this very lively Dvorak piece that was a lot of fun. It was dance, very dance-like. Dvorak was very influenced by his native Czechoslovakian folk music. And so the class came in. There was one little girl who was led over to me. She was deaf, and so she put her hand on my viola while I played so she could feel the vibrations of the instrument. And that was sweet. And then we played this lively Dvorak piece, and after we were finished, this one little boy, he jumped up on his chair and he said, "Thank you." And we thought, oh, that's so nice. He really enjoyed that. And as they were leaving, as the children were leaving, the teacher came over to us and she bent over and she said, "That is the first time I've heard that child speak." Now, to me, to this day, it gives me the shivers. To me, that is just evidence of the power of music. And another situation occurred when we were on tour in California, and we were playing at the Stanford Children's Hospital, very nice children's hospital that had actually had a little auditorium. And we did a special program, and we went to some of the rooms and played for the children who couldn't leave the rooms. We went to some of the rooms, but we did this program in the auditorium. And I noticed while we were playing that there was one young woman sitting in the audience, and she had a little baby in her lap, and she had a pump that she was squeezing with her hand. And I realized that she was breathing for the baby. And after we finished playing, she came over to us and she said, "I just wanted to thank you and tell you that while you were playing, I have never felt my baby so relaxed in my arms." So again, the power of music is just amazing to me. So playing for special audiences, I think, is a very particularly a special blessing to be able to do that. So I loved playing for the special needs adult daycare center. And one of the pieces I did for them, I did some fiddle tunes. So now I'll play for you one of the pieces I did there. It's called Fiddlesticks, and it uses a technique which is called shuffle, which is part of fiddle music. I'll demonstrate that. Probably you heard that before. Fiddlesticks. So, and I also played a short Bach piece. Now, this is a short movement. It's a dance movement from a set of 6 pieces that Bach wrote for the solo cello. Now, I think it's very interesting that Bach used numerology a lot in his music. And one of the ways he used numerology is that when he wrote a set of secular pieces, they were in sets of 6 to leave out Sunday, the Sabbath, the sacred day. So the Brandenburg concertos, these Bach cello suites, there's sonatas and for violin and keyboard. They're all in sets of 6. So Monday through Saturday music. And these Bach suites were based on French dance suites. There would be a prelude at the beginning, and then there would be a set of dances. They weren't intended to be danced to, but they were based on French dance, actual dance tunes. And this is the Bourrée. This is something that I think that Yo-Yo Ma has made famous. He's been playing these Bach suites quite a bit, and there's some wonderful videos of him playing. And he also, I just think this is incredible, he sold out Hollywood Bowl playing all 6 of these cello suites. I mean, to me, that's just an amazing thing. Since I have the violin and the viola here, I just want to point out a couple of the differences between violin and viola. Probably a lot of you already know, but it never hurts to share this information because we have both of them here. I'll hold up the violin and the viola together, and you can see that there's not much difference in size. They share 3 of the same strings. The violin has 1 higher string, the viola has 1 lower string. And the viola is 1 octave higher than the tuning of the cello, which is why these cello suites work so well on viola. They're an octave higher. So I'll hold up the violin and viola. I'm going to play for you the low string of the viola, and then the other 4 strings that are, other 3 strings that are the same as the violin. In children's concerts, I do a little thing with the viola where I make it sound like a cow. Kids love that, and I guess adults do too. And then another thing I would do in children's concerts is, you probably know that the bow has horsehair. And but you can really see it. If I take this little screw out on the bottom of the bow, you can see all the hair. It's very special hair, horsehair, that I believe comes from Siberia, from the horse's tails, because I guess because it's so cold there, their hair is quite thick. And there are these little tiny barbs on the bow hair. It's kind of like if you put them under a microscope, it would look like a saw. And that's what catches on the on the string. And then we put rosin on there, which is what ballet dancers also put on their shoes, and pitchers also put on their mitts, I think. That is very helpful to make the bow produce the sound. Okay, so moving on here. So the next thing that happened is that a sister-in-law invited me to a fundraiser that her church was doing, the Unitarian Church in Medford. They were having a ceilidh, and I didn't know what a ceilidh was. I had never heard of the ceilidh. Has anyone here ever heard of a ceilidh? Ah, yes. So maybe one of you can tell me what a ceilidh is. Or I'll tell you, to keep it simple.
It's Irish, isn't it Irish?
Yes, well, it's Irish, Scottish, British Isles. It's a night of music and socializing, and folk music, music from the British Isles. And it's spelled very oddly. It's Cadleigh. So they were doing this fundraiser. They had a couple come. It was a group called Fiddle and Box, which is violin and little accordion. They were very good. They played a concert for us, and there was a lovely meal, and then there was a dance. Before the event took place, they invited anyone, excuse me, who wanted to, was interested in participating to bring an instrument, and they would teach us a fiddle tune. So I figured nothing ventured, nothing gained. So I brought my violin, and I learned this little ditty. And the only word I caught when she was telling us about the song was coconut. I later looked it up online, and it's called Coconut Dance. Dance was the word I hadn't heard. So this is Coconut Dance. Thank you. So we're getting near the end here. Well, actually, we're not that near the end, sorry. We will have question and answers at the end, but actually, really, a couple of things happened that were a huge turning point for me. One is that I met a man named Jeff Plant, who is an auditory trainer. Now, I never knew that auditory training even existed. And I was very fortunate that he lived, his office was only 10 minutes from where I lived. And there were probably only about 10 people like him in the country. So the fact that he lived so close was amazing. And the point of auditory training is that, so when you have hearing loss, there is a physical condition which impairs your hearing. However, you still have a fully functioning brain. And the brain can be trained to make more use of what is coming in. And so that's the work that I've done with Jeff. And I have a handout on the, I have several handouts back there, which you're welcome. I only have a few of the, he has an organization called Hearing Rehabilitation Foundation. There's only a few of those sheets, but you're welcome to help yourself to those handouts. And Jeff, soon after I started working with him, asked me if I would take part in a symposium on music and hearing loss, and I was delighted. And so I did a program similar to this. It was the first time I did this program. And I played a piece that I think, a tune that I think you'll find very familiar. And then I'll tell you what happened. When I played that, I saw a woman, there was a woman in the second row, and she was raising her hand like this, and she said, "I'm sorry to interrupt," and there were tears running down her face. She said, "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to let you know that that is the first time since my hearing loss that I've been able to hear and appreciate music." Now, again, I thought, wow, the power of music is pretty incredible. And what I had learned from Jeff, excuse me, is that when you have hearing loss, hearing music gets much more challenging, more difficult. I already knew that. But what I learned from Jeff is that the simpler the music, the better. And that the more complex the music it is, the more it's prone to distortion and the harder it is to listen to. And Bob can attest to that. Hearing just a single instrument can be easier to listen to with hearing loss. I had noticed that in my car, if I turned on a classical music station and listened to a piece, like there's a Borodin string quartet that I loved and played a lot when I was at Apple Hill. When that came on, and I didn't even recognize it, it sounded completely atonal. The only thing that sounded familiar was the rhythm. So I think there was something about my hearing and the hearing aids and just made it impossible. However, I did enjoy in the car radio, on my CD player, I enjoyed solo guitar, acoustic guitar, playing things like jazz, just a single guitar, or maybe with a very small backup. Or I love the Great American Songbook, so things like Nat King Cole, Ella Fitzgerald, Frank Sinatra, that where there's a simple line in the song. Not that the music is that simple, but it's not complex in the way that there's a lot of instruments playing. So that I realized that that made a lot of sense. Just hearing a single instrument doesn't have all the complexity. And then I thought, well, gee, I can play for people with hearing loss. So it was largely out of that, thanks to Jeff, that I started doing my program for in senior centers, retirement communities, and churches. I've done it at churches, but and I love doing it. But I have to say, the biggest turning point was when there's a woman named Gail Haddam who does a one-woman program. It's called Life with a Cranky Cochlea. And it's funny, it's poignant, and she's very good. I went to the program. It was co-sponsored by Hearing Loss Association of America and ALDA, which is Association of Late Deafened Adults. And there's a resource sheet back there that gives information on both of these organizations. And so I was reading the publicity for this program, and in the publicity she said, "So you have hearing loss, so get over it. But first you have to grieve." And I realized that I had not done that. I had had this huge loss in my life, not only the means of communication, but my means of making a living, the love of my life, of playing music, my social life, because so many of my friends were musicians. And that when I had decided to treat it as a neutral event, I was in denial about what a big loss it was. And I was in denial about being depressed about it. So as soon as I started grieving for the hearing loss, I started realizing the sweetness on the other side and the hidden gifts of hearing loss. And one of those hidden gifts is that I never would have known the depth of the generosity and kindness of my friends and family if it weren't for the hearing loss. I also found that the hearing loss made me more humble and less egotistical about my playing, because I know that I will never be the musician that I once was, nor do I aspire to be. But I'm very grateful to have come back to playing and to communicating with people through playing. If it hadn't been for hearing loss, I would never have met Bob and his family. Very, very dear people. And I want to thank Bob so much for bringing me here and doing all the publicity. He did a wonderful job, and I'm just delighted that this all worked out. And thank him so much. And thank Peter for arranging this as well. So I am going to, we'll have time for questions and answers. And then there's wonderful homemade goodies over here. So there will be a reception, excuse me. And I enjoy talking one-on-one with people. And so I'll be sticking around for that. And I just want to make sure there's nothing else, nothing I left out. I always forget something. I wouldn't be here talking with you today if it wasn't for hearing loss. And I'm less of a perfectionist because there's no way I can be perfect, so that's fine, I accept it. And I actually enjoy playing more now than I did when I was a professional musician because I'm not so self-critical and I just do it, it's pure love. If someone had told me when I experienced my hearing loss and had to quit playing, if someone had said to me, well, you know, when life gives you lemons, make lemonade, I would have been furious. But that is kind of what happened. So I just want to read just a little thing I meant to read to you earlier, if I can find it. Yes, this is, I'm not just going to read very much of it. This is called the Heiligenstadt Testament that Beethoven wrote in 1802 when he was 28 years old. Now, I didn't realize how young he was when he started experiencing hearing loss. And a similarity, something that Beethoven and I have in common is that he wanted to hide his hearing loss. He didn't want people to know about it because he was a musician. So, but he could be very cranky. He had a reputation for being cranky, and I'm sure it was because of his hearing loss. And people didn't know that that's why he was being cranky. So he wrote this, and he addressed it to his two brothers, and he put it with his will, and it was to be read after he died. It's called the Heiligenstadt Testament because he would hear about cures for hearing loss, and he would go and chase these cures, and then they would turn out to be terribly disappointing. He had heard about a doctor in Heiligenstadt, which is a suburb of Austria, and he had gone following one of these will-o'-the-wisps, hopefully for a cure, which turned out not to be a cure, and so he was in Heiligenstadt. He was 28 when he wrote it, and he talked about suffering from this loss that it started 26 years before. So he was 22 when he started losing his hearing. So this is just one paragraph of it. Oh, you men who think or say that I am malevolent, stubborn, or misanthropic, how greatly do you wrong me. You do not know the secret cause which makes me seem that way to you. From childhood on, my heart and soul have been full of the tender feeling of goodwill, and I was ever inclined to accomplish great things, which he did. But think that for 6 years now I have been hopelessly afflicted, made worse by senseless physicians, from year to year deceived with hopes of improvement, finally compelled to face the prospect of a lasting malady, whose cure will take years or perhaps be impossible. Then he goes on to talk about how painful it was for him to be taking a walk in the woods with friends, and they'd say, oh, do you hear the shepherd's pipe? Listen to the shepherd's pipe, or listen to the birds, and he couldn't hear them. And then he also talks about how such incidents drove me almost to despair, little more, and I would have ended my life. So he was clearly feeling suicidal. And it's amazing that he went on to overcome this and be one of the greatest composers that ever lived. I do want to play one more little piece, little tune for you, and then I want to talk a little bit about hearing loss in general. I won't spend too much time on that, but this last one expresses better in music than I can in words how grateful I am to be able to be sharing the joy of music. Thank you, your wonderful audience. I just want to say a few words about hearing loss in general. I don't think there's, well, how should I start this? I think there's a lot of ignorance and misinformation about hearing loss, and I don't think people realize the devastating nature of hearing loss, because hearing loss is about communication. And when Helen Keller was asked if she had a choice between losing her hearing or losing her sight, which would she choose? She said she would rather lose her sight than her hearing, because hearing is about communication. So I think one of the big problems with hearing loss is isolation, and I think it's a big problem. And I think also that it's sad to think about this. Of course, hearing loss is associated with older age. And it is more common with older age, but it cuts through all ages. People of all ages experience hearing loss. And I think there's this kind of unfortunate stereotype of the elderly codger who sits in a corner and is very grumpy and doesn't talk to anyone. And that is, to me, is really very sad. It really isn't funny, because I've talked to so many people who have elderly relatives who, because of their hearing loss, they just withdrew more and more and no longer participated in family events. I also think that people don't realize how exhausting it is when you have hearing loss. You can hear up to a point if you're not totally deaf, but it's like being in a country where you don't know the language very well. So you're constantly working very hard to figure out what people are saying in order to communicate. And then added to that, that's the nature of life these days, that very seldom are there optimal conditions for hearing conversation. So there's often background music, not background music, just background noise. There's often at social gatherings, family gatherings, Thanksgiving or holidays, whatever, there's multiple conversations going on, which make it that much harder. So hearing loss takes a great deal of effort and is mentally fatiguing. I've found that I need to kind of pace myself. If I'm going to be in a situation where I'm going to be together socializing and talking to people, about one event like that a day is about what I can cope with. Occasionally more than that, but it really takes a toll. Also, I think that people, one problem is, well, the expense is a big problem. Another problem is that people get hearing aids. They put them on, they say, this is terrible, these don't work, and they end up in a drawer, in the back of some drawer, on a cabinet or something. And it takes the brain time to adapt. So I would say if you're trying out hearing aids for the first time, give it at least a month and wear them all the time, and get 2 hearing aids. Binary hearing aids are better. And hearing aids now are digital, so they can be adjusted, and you can keep going back to the audiologist and have them adjusted. They communicate with each other. So you really need to practice with the hearing aids and get used to them. I read something a while back. It was one of those like Harvard or Yale health newsletter, saying that there was a link between Alzheimer's and hearing loss. And the theory was that it was because it's such a brain strain that it wears out the brain. Now, when I read that, I thought, that doesn't make any sense to me, because I think it's good for your brain to have to work hard. And now what they're saying, which makes much more sense to me, that the link may be because of social isolation. And I think that makes a lot more sense, that if you become socially isolated, you're not getting the stimulus of the brain, and that's important for the brain. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I wanted to say about hearing loss. One thing that I would love to see is that audiologists are good at what they do. They're trained to fit people, to give audiology exams and to fit people for hearing aids. But basically, and some people may object to this, and I'm sure there are exceptions, but basically they're salespeople. They're selling hearing aids, and generally they sell whatever model of hearing aid, whatever hearing aid company they represent. You normally don't have much of a choice. And there are all kinds of what's called HATs, hearing assistive technology. There are these all kinds of devices that can be helpful, but you have to try them out, and everyone's hearing loss is different. There's a lot of commonality in terms of hearing loss, but everyone's individual. So if audiologists had some examples of this technology, showed you how to use it, and let you borrow it for a month, and then decide if you wanted to buy it, that would be a huge help. So I would just like to make a plug for audiologists to be better at educating people. For example, I didn't know that I thought that my hearing loss was just going to keep getting worse and worse, and eventually I'd be totally deaf. I didn't know there was such a thing as a cochlear implant, which can restore hearing up to a point. And people I know who've gotten them love them. So anyway, I'm sure I'll go home tonight and think, oh, I wish I had remembered to tell them such and such a thing. But now I want to leave it open to questions, if anyone has any questions, and then I'll pass around the microphone, and then we will partake of the wonderful refreshments. Yes. Oops.
First of all, I'm speechless. I'm a professional violinist and music teacher, and I knew I know your name, and I know one of my former students perhaps studied with you. She loved being at the Apple Hill Chamber Players.
Great.
So I want to thank you, first of all, for being a tremendous power of example and inspiration to not just to us, but to everyone in this world who's obviously affected by this. So that's the first thing. Two things that are going through me. Number one, having been a member of Vermont Symphony, and at one point during one of the pieces, I was sitting at the back of the second violin section, just about in the timpani, and I had to play the concert with one earplug in so I could hear myself. Many of us know that we live in a very chronically noisy, overstimulative world. I personally am blown away that one can have hearing loss starting at such a young age as 50, and I would appreciate hearing what causes hearing loss not related to the outside stimulus in the world. And the second thing relates to your work abroad in Israel. I think it was 60 Minutes that featured, was it Daniel Barenboim? And I'm wondering if you ever had the opportunity to meet or connect or work with him. Thank you.
Thank you. We may have even played together because I was a ringer in the Vermont Symphony from time to time. So nice to meet you and connect with you. Thank you for your kind words. So let's see. While you were talking, I thought of a couple of things. One thing that surprised me is that I learned through this series that Peter O'Dowd did on WBUR, which I was part of that series. And one of the series, he interviewed a audiologist in Toronto who specializes in treating hearing loss for musicians. And I think a lot of his clients are rock musicians. But what really surprised me was that he said that classical musicians are much more likely to experience exposure-related hearing loss than rock musicians, because classical musicians play many more hours than rock musicians do. They practice for hours, they teach, and then concerts can be relatively long. So the constancy of the exposure, the duration of the exposure is much greater. Now, apparently, I always thought that hearing loss caused by exposure can come from really loud, going to a really loud rock concert and have the volume turned up. Now, apparently, if you do that from time to time, your hearing can, the hairs in your ear are like a field of wheat. And when there's really loud noise, it's like the wheat all bends over. But if you have time to recuperate, then the wheat comes back up. But if the exposure lasts too long, over too long a period of time, the wheat just stays down there. So if you have occasional very loud exposure, that's not going to cause long-term hearing loss. Audiology exams do give us some information, but they don't give us the whole picture because they're not testing hearing in normal listening conditions. They're very specific conditions. And as far as I know, audiology exams haven't changed since I was in grade school. They're basically do the same things. The cupcake, cowboy, baseball, it's even the same. I've gotten so I memorized those words. So I don't think it's actually a good test for me because I hear boo and I say baseball. So, but I have noticed that the auditory training that I had does help me do speech recognition better. Oh yes, Daniel Barenboim. Okay, so actually I'm proud to say that we came up with this idea of playing for peace long before Daniel Barenboim did. So we had been doing it for years when he started, and by the time he started, I had left Apple Hill. I was no longer there. So it's kind of like Apple Hill does their thing, he does his thing. I think his thing is more orchestral, which is great. I think it's great. The more people who do it, the merrier. And also another thing, it's better to get hearing aids earlier rather than later. The sooner you get them, the more time your brain has to adapt. So it's better not to wait too long, because if you wait longer, then they may not be quite as successful. So I'm going to thank you all so much, and